I thought, in talking about the impact of the war in Ukraine and thinking about Japan's foreign policy, that I would sort of frame this around the question of whether the changes we're seeing, some of which Christina alluded to in her opening remarks, represent a fundamental change or are prompted by the war itself, or whether they reflect longer incremental changes that have been underway for perhaps certainly years, if not decades. When one thinks back to some of the changes in Japanese foreign policy that we associate with the premiership of Prime Minister Koizumi, or even going back to the 1980s and the premiership of former Prime Minister Nakasone, we have seen what Michael Green, perhaps one of the most well-regarded US-Japan specialists, has described as a process of incremental change in Japan's security policy. And I would argue, even allowing for some of the significant changes we've seen in the last few weeks as a result of the war, it is probably fair to say that these represent deeper incremental structural changes. But I'll come back to that in more substance in my later remarks. In terms of the immediate proximate causes of change and the nature of change, I would distinguish between declaratory policy and substantive policy when we think about Japanese security posture. It is very striking, I think, not only that Prime Minister Kishida attended the NATO summit, the first Japanese Prime Minister to do just that, but also the language he's been using to describe the challenge of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. It's very unusual for a Japanese premier to be quite as outspoken and to use some of the language that Prime Minister Kishida has adopted in referring to Moscow, describing Russia's actions as, quote, outrageous. I attended a recent speech by the Prime Minister at the Guildhall in London where he used very similar language. And it's worth reflecting on how much of a departure that means, that represents from the previous statements we've seen from Japanese premiers. Prime Minister Abe, of course, who has taken a very, former Prime Minister Abe, who took a very assertive position on security policy, was much more, how would I put this, nuanced or muted in describing Japan's relations with Russia. Part of that has reflected the importance of identity politics. Former Prime Minister Abe was very keen, particularly towards the end of his tenure as premier, to reach or try and reach an agreement with Russia over the so-called disputed northern territories, the Hoppo Ryodo, which remain those four southernmost islands, the two Kuril Islands and the smaller islands of Shikotan and Habamai, still occupied by Russia, and remain an unresolved legacy of World War II that conservative politicians, and Abe in particular, have been keen to address. But the war in the Ukraine has, I think, changed that, certainly in terms of the posture of the Japanese government and the language of Prime Minister Kishida. Another kind of key element in this shift in declaratory policy is the linkage between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. So we heard the Prime Minister talk about Europe and Indo-Pacific security being, quote, indivisible, re-emphasized in his meetings with European counterparts, with Charles Michel, of course, the President of the European Council, and of course, the German Chancellor in his capacity as President of the G7. Alongside that statement, of course, very clear statements as they relate to the danger of contagion, the perception in Tokyo that the absence of a strong, unified international response to Russia might embolden other countries, obviously China in the context of Asia, to take action over Taiwan. And that, of course, is behind this interesting statement from the Prime Minister that Ukraine may be East Asia tomorrow. The Japanese, of course, are very alarmed at multiple signs of China's increasing assertiveness, not just in the East China Sea over the disputed Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands, but also, of course, the broader question of China's attempts to develop natural gas energy fields in the East China Sea, or, of course, the question of Taiwan, which remains a source of concern to so many actors. The third element in declaratory policy, which I think is worth highlighting from the recent NATO summit, is the Prime Minister's reference to saying we want to build a partnership of solidarity, of freedom and democracy that links Europe and the Indo-Pacific. From that, I take as evidence this statement indicates that beyond conventional security, there's a larger project involving diplomatic and political cooperation between Japan and multiple European partners. And this, of course, builds on what some people have referred to as a concerted strategy of minilateralism and an attempt to court and cultivate European actors to play a greater role in the Indo-Pacific, whether that's France under President Macron, or Britain, for, of course, through its own commitment to a much more high-profile symbolic role in the Indo-Pacific. And perhaps most interestingly recently, the agreement between London and Tokyo to sign a new reciprocal access agreement designed to strengthen security cooperation between the UK and Japan. We've also seen on the sidelines, of course, of the NATO summit, a commitment by Japan to support Sweden's admission to NATO. Again, pretty unprecedented in terms of the Japanese government's willingness to occupy that diplomatic space. And alongside that, strengthening the importance of cooperation with other countries, including, for example, with Canada, in strengthening the Indo-Pacific region. Going beyond the rhetoric and the declaratory policy on substantive issues, of course, it's the presence of Japan and South Korea, along with Australia and New Zealand, at the NATO summit that gives substance to the idea of linkages between the Indo-Pacific and Europe. As Christina mentioned, a commitment to revamp the partnership with NATO. The 2014 Japan-NATO Individual Partnership and Cooperation Programme will, I understand, be developed into a more substantive agreement. We still don't know what that's going to look like, but the commitment to actually look at that again and to open a so-called new era of Japan-NATO cooperation, I think is significant. This might involve the sending of self-defense force personnel to NATO headquarters, joint participation in joint NATO-Japanese military exercises with partners from both Japan and NATO countries in an observer capacity. And again, I think we shouldn't underestimate the symbolic importance of this. This is all part of a much more muscular security policy on the part of the Japanese government. Beyond security, of course, it's the economic response to Russia's actions, where Japan has both opportunities and I think faces challenges. The opportunities, of course, have been very much concentrated in the support for providing humanitarian assistance to the government of Ukraine, as well as non-lethal aid to support the Ukraine and its efforts to counteract the Russian invasion. We've just seen a commitment, a renewed commitment of an additional $100 million worth of support from the Japanese government to Ukraine, which would bring the cumulative total of Japanese assistance to the Ukraine to $1.1 billion, not insignificant. And also the wider impact of the war in the Ukraine, particularly the impact on food security, another issue where Japan, of course, has historically had major concerns given its dependence on foreign food imports. Japan has committed to provide an additional $200 million to alleviate the global food crisis as a result of the conflict in the Ukraine. And then as part of the G7 discussions, of course, we saw further discussion about the idea of caps on oil prices as a means of restricting Russia's access to foreign financial resources. Prime Minister Kishida has supported that in principle, but also, very importantly, signalled some of the challenges that Japan faces by talking about the limits of Japan's ability to support this new initiative, because policy needs to be consistent with so-called national interests. And by this, I think he's referencing Japan's heavy dependence on Russian oil and natural gas. 9% of Japan's natural gas comes from Russia, 2% of its oil supplies, derived from Russian imports. And we know that the business lobby in Japan, of course, in the form of both Mitsubishi and Mitsui, who are closely involved in the Sakhalin-2 pipeline initiatives, is not insignificant in terms of restricting Japan's ability to respond perhaps as wholeheartedly as other countries might have done in response to the crisis. It's not just, of course, the economic impact and the implications in terms of energy security for Japan, but also a worry that if Japan were to cancel those key projects, not only would it experience significant economic impact, but it would also provide a new opportunity for China to fill the gap, to fill the breach, if you like. And of course, given Japan's worries about China's growing military and economic clout, it's very understandable why policymakers are wary about taking that initiative. So moving from those immediate proximate responses in terms of rhetoric and structural changes, how big a change does this more assertive security policy represent in terms of Japanese foreign policy? At one level, Mr. Kishida's forthright statements might seem somewhat surprising. He has, for much of his career as a senior LDP politician, and of course, a man who served as 4 years as foreign minister under Mr. Abe, had a great deal of experience in the foreign policy sphere, but has long been considered somewhat of a dove on foreign policy issues, in contrast to former Prime Minister Abe. But we have seen him become increasingly more assertive, I would say more hawkish on a range of issues. That was certainly the case during the LDP presidential election, the contest to succeed former Prime Minister Suga that took place in September of last year, where we saw Mr. Kishida taking a very unusual position, for example, highlighting the vulnerability of Taiwan, making it clear that Japan would need to consider how best to support its key alliance partner, the United States, in the event of a crisis over Taiwan. And that represented, I think, both tactically a smart move on the part of the politician, Mr. Kishida, but also, I think, a reflection of these broader challenges that Japan faces in the region. In some ways, Mr. Kishida is the natural heir to Mr. Abe, but there are, I think, substantive differences between him and the former Prime Minister. Before I get to those, let me again stress how important it is to recognize that Japan's incremental approach to a more assertive, more conventional, some would say more normal security posture, less constrained by Article 9 of the Constitution, really goes back to the end of the Cold War. And the Gulf Wars, the two Gulf Wars in which Japan was roundly criticized by the United States and by other countries for being seen to be insufficiently assertive in supporting the international community. The impact of that was not missed on both politicians and civil servants, particularly in the foreign ministry and in the defense community, who felt it was very important in the face of that criticism to develop a more robust security policy. And of course, close to home, the challenge of North Korea, now of course re-emphasized by worries about a possible 7th nuclear test from Pyongyang, the proliferation of missile launches, somewhere in the order of 30 plus in the course of this year alone, has meant that for defense policymakers and for increasingly public opinion in Japan, a more conventional security policy is increasingly important. And then of course, the other big long-term change is the threat from China. China's growing maritime presence in the region, its incursions over the Senkaku Islands, has all added up to a new cross-party consensus within the Japanese political establishment, not just within the LDP, but also amongst some of the LDP's key partners, Komeito, for example, about the need to confront China on a range of issues. It's very striking if you follow debates in the Japanese parliament, the Diet, increasingly how younger conservative politicians are singling China out for criticism, not just on the issue of territorial disputes, but also on human rights over the status of Hong Kong, the concerns over the rights of the Uyghur minorities, efforts to develop a so-called Japanese version of the Magnitsky Act to impose sanctions on Chinese political and economic actors. All of this reflect this important change in attitudes and worries about China's threat to the so-called status quo. A fourth longer-term structural factor, which perhaps hasn't had as much emphasis as perhaps might be appropriate, is longer-term worries about the reliability of the United States. And that might seem a surprising thing for me to say, given the efforts made by the Biden administration to enhance cooperation with Japan, which we saw, of course, at this NATO meeting. The first meeting in 5 years between the United States, South Korea and Japan, an important trilateral coordinated effort to strengthen alliance cooperation. And I welcome that. It's a sign of the importance of the trilateral relationship and the long-term historical significance of those alliance partnerships. But alliance partnerships which are, of course, fundamentally challenged by Biden's predecessor, Donald Trump, and the perception in Tokyo that the United States, under a more populist president, was willing to engage in a very transactional style of foreign policy making, has, I think, raise concerns amongst civil servants and politicians about the dependability of the United States. And of course, it's fear of abandonment, or at least fear of a perhaps more conditional American commitment to Japan that has shaped, I think, the push for a greater and more assertive security policy. This, of course, has filtered through into the wider public discourse. And it's important, I think, to stress how much public opinion is fluid in Japan. More than 50% of the Japanese public, depending on whose polls you read, now support a more assertive defense posture, greater spending on defense, an increase in the share of gross national product beyond the existing 1% level to perhaps as much as 2% of GDP or GMP. Is a measure, I think, of how public attitudes are changing. Recent polls suggest that in the upcoming upper house election, foreign and security policies will be the second most important issue for ordinary voters going to the polls, with about 45% of the electorate saying that these issues matter almost as much as the traditional economic bread and butter issues that have typically dominated Japanese elections. But where Mr. Kishida does differ, I would say, from Mr. Abe is on the question of economic policy. And this is an issue which I think I would like to come back to in the Q&A session, because I'm conscious I'm over my time. But I think it's important to emphasize that Mr. Kishida's heritage, his debt to his to other previous prime ministers, particularly Mr. Ikeda, who was prime minister in the 1960s, his commitment to policies designed to enhance public welfare and to deal with the economic hardships being faced, particularly by older voters. All of this puts a brake on his ability to deliver on some of the bolder security policies that I've outlined already. So let me end by saying what we're seeing is important incremental change in Japanese security policy, reaffirmed by the events in the Ukraine. And the last issue, again, to put on the table for our discussion during the Q&A session is what impact will this have on the much more substantive question of constitutional revision and identity politics, an issue which, of course, is at the heart of conservative politics, particularly within the LDP.
What I'll do in my 15 minutes is I'll provide you with a summary of nuclear policy impacts, both on Germany and on Japan, both in the civil realm and in the military realm. So that's going to be really sort of an executive summary that will hopefully bring you up to date on that. Before I start, I just wanted to, of course, make the caveat that the kind of policy decisions that I'm going to present here are going to be descriptive in that I don't necessarily share these views that I'll talk about. And also that, of course, the situation is rapidly evolving and there's a lot of uncertainty, and particularly in the nuclear realm, there's a lot of, information is classified. And if I knew everything that was going to happen in the future, I would have a very different job, than being a university professor. So there's this caveat. And thirdly, let me just issue a message of gratitude to my team, including Dennis Bertram, who's taken time to really dig deep into the most recent Japanese press coverage on the issue as it's unfolding, and also my colleagues at the Kennedy School who have been very informative and helpful in preparing for this. Now, where do we stand with regard to nuclear restarts and nuclear, perhaps lifetime extensions, both in Germany and Japan? Let me start with Japan, because there the issue is, I think, more acute. We've heard about the lack of resources. We've heard about the dependence on Russia with regard to liquid natural gas and the Sakhalin project that is now a little bit at stake for Japan. So the nuclear debate naturally has reemerged, and that is supported by public polls. We now have, for the first time after the Fukushima accident, a public majority, if you believe the Nikkei polls, of about 53% in support of increasing the share of nuclear energy. That is a political window of opportunity that, from a political point of view, is, I think, very valuable for the current government. At the same time, of course, the regulatory and safety hurdles do remain. And there's really, I think I've just this morning talked to a nuclear policymaker of the LDP in Tokyo, and he described this situation with the restart still as a chaos and no breakthrough. Less so with regard to the ongoing suits against the restarts, the so-called Sashitomeseikyu litigation brought by citizens against the restarts, but really very much a regulatory problem. The LDP hopes that this is going to be a little bit easier for them after the elections if they win the upper house. They hope that the independent regulator will perhaps be more favorable to nuclear restarts given the current situation on the global energy market. What is the situation in Germany? In Germany, the discussions are much less humble, and they're primarily, so let's talk about the economics, let's talk about the politics and also the technology, because these are all three different aspects. It's primarily the German Liberal Democrats, the FDP, that is talking about this, in part attempting to distinguish itself from its coalition partners with a policy position. The Greens, which hold the Ministry for Energy, are much more reluctant, although they've been very progressive with regard to increasing the share of coal-fired power plants. But there's really very much reluctance due to respect for the political basis of the Green Party. Now, either way, in Germany, Germany has the choice of either restarting, like Japan, power stations that have already been shut off, or extending the lifetime of the 3 reactors we still have in operation, which are scheduled for closure at the end of this year. But anyway, I think technically it's only a discussion about 2 reactors, and you would have to first, of course, amend the German nuclear law, which sets forth phase-out timings. You would have to think about staff. That's not a problem because we still have our plants staffed, the ones that are operating. And then you'll have to think about the fuel. This is the biggest problem. I think the minimum solution that's feasible is that we continue to use the fuel rods that are in operation, because they can be extended for 2 or 3 months beyond the statutory deadline, because the technical state of the fuel rods is very different from the legal timing of the phase out. So there would be an opportunity for an extension, but because one of the reactors at least is situated in Baden-Württemberg, the one at Neckar-Westheim, that would create a difficult choice also for the local state officials, because EnBW, the nuclear utility company, is in part owned by the government that's now operated by the Greens. So I think the chances in Germany for a nuclear restart are mainly, if you look at it from an economic perspective, because the threat to the German energy security is really real. It'll depend on what happens after the end of July, when we see how much gas the Russians will pump through Nord Stream 1. So I think from an economic and technical perspective, at least extending the currently operating plants for about 2 or 3 months using the existing fuel rather than trying to manufacture and procure new fuel rods, I think that's technically and economically a very reasonable idea. Whether politically it's a reasonable idea, that remains to be seen. Now, moving on to a second hot topic, both for Japan and for Germany, in less so, is nuclear sharing. The idea of extended deterrence through the actual deployment of nuclear weapons in Japan. And this is a very hotly debated topic, well, at least within the LDP, because Abe, for instance, is one of the supporters of nuclear sharing, which is in German nuclear Teilhabe of Japan, whereas Kishida adopts a more dovish position and has repeatedly stated that he will not depart from Japan's existing 3 non-nuclear rules, which include that no nuclear weapon should be manufactured or stationed or deployed in Japan, both land and sea. But there is an interesting discussion between the political parties in Japan and within the LDP. And actually, this is going much further than only nuclear sharing. We're even talking about nuclear missile defense, which is going to be the next topic. But let me briefly return to Germany. In Germany, the nuclear sharing is already happening. So there's one airbase in southwestern Germany where German airplanes have access to American nuclear weapons in case of need. And so here there's more a change in the delivery system, because the 100 billion defense budget announced by the Chancellor is likely to include procurement of F-35 fighters. Japan is also likely to include F-35 fighters, which are, in theory, nuclear capable. So we have a kind of a parallel development here. Now, rushing on to the next question, which is missile defense. Missile defense has been identified as a lack in the capabilities, both of the Japanese SDF and the German Bundeswehr, because firstly, the existing Patriot systems, land-based Patriot systems, they can be overwhelmed by numbers, by sheer numbers, but also overwhelmed by hypersonic missiles, right? So we have a parallel situation in both countries that there is a lack of missile defense that has been exposed very urgently by the Ukraine war. And so we have different procurement projects going on. An official at the German Ministry of Defense told me yesterday that chances are high that Germany is going to procure the Israeli Arrow 3 missile system for creating a German Iron Dome that would also extend on parts of Poland, etc. Whereas in Japan, there's a similar situation that missile defense against nuclear, but also conventional missiles is in dire need. But they are more likely to look for other technological solutions. There has been much talk about the SM-3 Aegis-based system, but they've had problems with the booster. So this seems to be off the table. And Japan is really, it's very open as to what kind of technology they will use to counter this threat. One possibility, because in Japan, technological solutions are always very popular, is even laser-based missile defense, which would be sea-based. That's a technological, I don't want to say pipe dream because I'm not an expert on this, but you would have to have a lot of energy to power these lasers, and there, that's where SMRs could come into play. Now, small modular reactors have been a hot topic in the nuclear world for a long time, not so much in Germany, but also in Japan. And so there you have one of the connections between the civil use of SMRs for energy security and the potential military use of SMRs to power these anti-missile systems. But that's very much speculation. Now, I've run through these three different policy areas, both for Japan and Germany. All right, now, I think one of the interesting questions that a lot of people in the nuclear policy sphere are really scratching their heads about has to do with nuclear deterrence, right? So nuclear deterrence is a theoretical concept on which we've relied for decades, which seems to have worked during the Cold War. And now serious questions are being asked whether it still works, right? Because some people would say the mere fact that we see the war in Ukraine means that deterrence hasn't worked. But some people say, no, actually, what we see is that it does work, because nobody's directly countering Russia, and that's a sign that nuclear deterrence does work. But there's really a new situation for Europe where nuclear bullying is explicitly used in a conventional war. And I think this is really what people have to get their heads around, because we've only seen this so far with India and Pakistan, that we have conventional confrontations under the threat of nuclear war. But there's really, I think, much to be thought about, especially in the direction, is it really a good idea to have these weapons on a global scale? On the other hand, it's very likely to think that many states around the world will see it as a good idea to have nuclear weapons and interpret the situation in Ukraine so as that hadn't Ukraine relinquished its arsenal in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, they wouldn't have been attacked. Now, whether that's a correct assumption is actually questionable, but that's a different question. There's, of course, a big question for nuclear non-proliferation. What is going to be the future of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, of which Germany and Japan are both, of course, signatories, but also about the alternative treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which only came into force last year, and is kind of challenging the NPT regime, and I think with very good arguments and reasons, and a potential development that we could see in the near future, in which Germany and Japan will see themselves caught here, might be that there's I think an increasing division of countries being totally terrified of what's going on in Ukraine and saying we have to increase disarmament, we have to really speed it up, we have to go for the TPNW, prohibition of nuclear weapons, and then another side which says no, this shows that we need deterrence and we need nuclear weapons, and that's the kind of discourse we may possibly observe in Poland, we do observe in Japan, not so much in Germany. So this is really the division that's likely to come with regard to disarmament. Maybe in my last minute or two, if I have that, let me address perhaps the biggest question, and I think it's the most puzzling and certainly highest stakes question, and that's the question of the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons and what that would mean for Germany and Japan. Now, of course, this is absolutely uncertain, and no person on the planet, except perhaps one person, can make a good assessment of that future question. But we have to distinguish the different scenarios. One scenario is, of course, strategic use of nuclear weapons by Russia. Most experts agree that the probability is relatively low because there's really a lack of targets, and it's really not matching into the Russian posture and strategy. The other question is tactical use. People say that's less unlikely, still very low, because if you kind of deploy a tactical nuclear weapon on Ukrainian soil, and they want to invade the country, they'd have to take care of this in the aftermath, right? Which would be a headache for themselves. Which means there is the other question of an inadvertent use, right? There are a lot of examples from the Cold War history about very close calls of misreading radar systems, whatever, that would have almost triggered a nuclear exchange. And so there is really, I think, one of the biggest dangers is the inadvertent kind of accidental scenarios of escalation. And finally, there is, of course, the scenario of a so-called sea burst, right? One could think that as a sign of resolve, Putin would detonate a smaller yield nuclear weapon, say over the Black Sea, and so-called strategy to escalate to de-escalate, that's what it's called. And there, I think people are very concerned about what would one do in that case, because it is conceivable that in a situation where Russia, or the regime in Russia is feeling under threat, or under a stalemate that it cannot break, there really is a scenario that there would be one bomb detonated over the Black Sea as a pressure to Zelensky, and what would Zelensky do if Russia says, look, either you're going to quit resistance or we're going to next, bomb Kiev, or any other part of Ukraine, right? So how would Zelensky be able to respond to that if millions of his own population are at stake? What do you do then? And that's really, the biggest puzzle. Joe Nye, a colleague at Harvard, says that the probability of that happening, this kind of nuclear bullying, nuclear threat, he sees a probability between 1% and 1 in 1,000. I think these quantitative assessments are almost impossible to make, but I think this is, just to end on this, this is the range of potential worst case scenarios that we're talking about. And this is why I think foreign policy questions and nuclear policy questions are so closely linked in this situation in which we are. Thank you very much.